In 1942, socialite Doris Castle Ross's glittering world came to a brutal end. One December day, she took a fatal overdose of sleeping pills at the Dorchester Hotel. But it was why she did that was truly wild. It can be a rough life when you social climb your way into history, and no one knew that better than Doris Delavigne, the Viscountess of Castle Ross. Her nickname was the Mistress of Mayfair, for the vast number of beds she seduced her way into around London. Now, although Doris came from humble beginnings, as her father was a French hatmaker in London, she knew what she wanted early in life. At the age of 18, she began working next to the high and mighty of England, selling used gowns to actresses. But for Doris, who was blonde, beautiful, and fine-featured, this was only a stepping stone. While working in the dress trade, Doris met the person who would change her life. Actress Gertrude Lawrence invited Doris to room with her in the posh neighborhood of Mayfair, and it gave Doris a whole new perspective on life. Lawrence was the mistress of a cavalry officer and had fancy cars, elegant parties, and constant jewels at her command. Suddenly, Doris began to see just how cushy the world of a kept woman was. There's certainly no shame in a woman making it into society any way she could, but Doris wasn't most women. In short order, she became positively addicted to Lawrence's kind of lifestyle. She was ravenous for extravagance, and she knew just how to get it. It wasn't long before Doris took a page out of her friend Gertrude's book and snagged herself a wealthy lover of her own. While trawling the uppity clubs in town, her first major conquest was the American millionaire, Laddie Sanford. The terms of their relationship were very clear from the beginning. Sanford gave Doris a new house, an allowance big enough to buy her a Rolls Royce, and her own personal maid. And what did Doris give him in exchange? Well, she was good in bed. Doris was an unabashed social climber, yes, but her determination wasn't the only key to her success. She had a very dirty secret weapon. Word got around fast that Doris was a dynamo in the sack. Unfortunately, no matter how good she was in bed, she was also turning into a monster. Doris's bedroom appetites were only matched by her need for constant material comforts. On Sanford's bill, she insisted on ordering Italian shoes, 250 pairs at a time, since she believed it was, quote, idiotic to wear shoes more than 3 or 4 times, quote. She was even more flippant about her Parisian silk stockings. Those she only wore once before chucking them out. But her gravy train at the time was about to break down. Whatever Doris's carnal charms, Laddie Sanford didn't stay captivated for long. He not only struck up an affair with the beautiful, noble, and rich Edwina Mountbatten, he up and left Doris in the process. Now sure, Doris still got to keep her house and her fancy things, but she still needed a cash influx, and she came up with a shrewd but chilling solution. Doris Castle Ross went to the dark side. Around this time, Doris moved from being a kept woman to becoming a full-on courtesan. She filled her schedule with a rotating stable of men, usually the recklessly extravagant sons of the aristocrats. Prince George, son of King George V, even got into trouble for enjoying himself at one of her raucous parties. For Doris, the slide down to the underworld of London was soft as silk. That didn't mean it wasn't dangerous. Doris now had to live on her wits and beauty alone, and it wasn't as easy as it looked. She became a regular fixture at clubs like Café de Paris, hoping to attract rich men into her silken web. She even developed another trademark. People called her the girl with the white gloves, because she took to wearing classy white opera gloves wherever she went. It was as good a calling card as any, and she soon landed her next meal ticket, the Canadian stockbroker Sir Edward Edgar, but she didn't land him for long. Doris now had permanently expensive tastes, and any man who wanted her had to pay through the nose. Of course, with a reputation like hers, many a gentleman like Sir Edward Edgar were willing to pay the price of admission, although this time it ended in his destruction. Before long, Edgar filed for bankruptcy, no doubt in partial thanks to Doris's demands. So once again, Doris was alone, and she was about to enter a very infamous era. At 28 years old, Doris met Valentine Brown, the Viscount Castle Ross. But don't let this fancy name fool you. There is perhaps no one more notorious in London than the Viscount. As a gossip columnist for the Sunday Express, and lackey to the sly Lord Beaverbrook, Castle Ross was an expert in sleaze. And where Doris was all moon-faced beauty, the Viscount Castle Ross was not so much. Don't go picturing a romance hero swooping Doris off her feet. Instead, Castle Ross was overweight, balding, and generally considered something of a social failure in polite society. Now, from the moment he saw Doris, the Viscount wanted to have her. Doris, knowing a paycheck when she saw one, obliged, but she refused to make him her one and only. Now, when constantly sending expensive gifts her way didn't tame her, Castle Ross pilfered the key to her house and let himself in whenever he pleased. And Doris, she didn't seem to mind, and that's when the dysfunction truly hit. Doris was no pushover, and Castle Ross was a man clinging hard to his failing sense of superiority. It was a very bad combination. When they fought, it often turned into something more like a blowout bar fight than a lover's quarrel, with Doris biting and scratching at her man anywhere she could. And the first time one of these fights happened, the Viscount hit her back after she bit and clawed at him. So now, with Doris walking around London visibly bruised, the Viscount's boss, Lord Beaverbrook, naturally shamed the man for it, but Castle Ross would merely roll up his trouser legs to reveal his own wounds, almost as if he was absolved. Doris and her Viscount were a match made in the fires of Hades, but they just couldn't seem to quit each other. They developed into a scandal. Castle Ross came from an uppity Irish Catholic family, and his battle-axe mother, Lady Kenmare, disapproved of Doris on the grounds that she was neither Catholic nor classy. But with Doris being Doris and the Viscount being the Viscount, they had to go and spit in everybody's faces. In 1928, Doris and the Viscount went down to the Hammersmith Registry Office and made it official, marrying in a quick and dirty ceremony. Of course, the Viscount's well-connected mother found out about the union, and of course, her reaction was unhinged. She cut the Viscount off completely from his inheritance. Suddenly, Doris realized she'd backed the wrong thoroughbred, and her next decision was cutthroat. For the newly minted Doris Castle Ross, everything had a price, even her marriage. So when the Viscount's mother greatly reduced his circumstances, Doris performed a cold-hearted act in an instant. She began taking right back up with a slew of other men, ones who had the means to fund the lifestyle she wanted. Now, men weren't the only source of Doris's income. She also dabbled in other nefarious activities, including selling out her famous friends. See, her husband's boss, Lord Beaverbrook, had gossip rags to run, and he paid Doris to be a society spy and spill the beans on the going-ons of the lives of the aristocrats. She happily took his money and performed the slimy duties. Soon enough, Doris seemed to be sleeping with half of London, and she was none too discreet about it. With so much gossip going on about her, it wasn't long before her husband tracked all her movements and the members of her little black book. But when she took up next with the Conservative Member of Parliament, Sir Alfred Beat, the Viscount absolutely snapped. Viscount Castle Ross burst right into the room, catching them red-handed. He began to beat Sir Beat so hard with his walking stick, Doris cried out "murder" from the sidelines. Maybe this was a turning point, because Doris moved on to a different breed of man entirely. Doris's whole identity revolved around her bedroom prowess, and she even liked to proclaim, quote, "There's no such thing as an impotent man, just an incompetent woman," quote. This led her to a ridiculous conclusion. She began to believe that she could cure a man's homosexuality just by being herself. Obsessed with the idea of turning a man straight through her sheet skills, Doris went to great lengths to convert the very gay Robert Herbert Percy, who was known around town as the Mad Boy. Her methods were mind-boggling. As a 25th birthday present, Doris bought Robert a room at the Ritz. When he opened the door, his jaw dropped. He realized that as part of Doris's unorthodox cure, she had hired an additional woman to help her out. Only, this wasn't going to be a pleasurable experience, as you might imagine. Doris wanted Robert to get violent with the woman, thinking that this was the solution. Now, Doris was not someone you said no to, but Robert did try. He only made half-hearted attempts at hitting the poor woman, and in turn had to witness a horrific sight. Frustrated, Doris snatched the whip from him and began to do the job herself, giving the woman a welt. Yes, she was that terrifying. Around this time, Doris struck up an affair with Randolph Churchill, who was the spitting image of his father, Winston Churchill, with none of the elder's goodness or good sense. To everyone who knew him, Randolph was an oaf who drank double brandies from the age of 19. In other words, he was perfect for Doris, who nicknamed him, quote, Fuzzy Wuzzy, quote. Now, I'm sure it will shock absolutely no one to hear that by 1930s, Doris and her husband were estranged from each other. They were also in a huge bind. Divorce back then wasn't so easy to come by. The courts needed adultery in play, which Doris had plenty of. They also needed her to prove it, along with evidence of their estrangement. To fulfill this, she took a trip around the Orient, taking up with a man named Sir William Roots for good measure. Only Roots was hiding a dirty little secret. In the middle of her whirlwind affair with Roots, there was something Doris didn't know. He was a very good friend of her estranged husband, and many believe it was Viscount Castle Ross who put Roots up to it, just to ensure the upcoming divorce proceedings were airtight. Only Doris seems to have found out about this because her next act was pure vengeance. Doris was miserable in her marriage, yes, but she hated her husband so much that she couldn't resist some good old mutually assured destruction. After the Roots debacle, she found out where the Viscount was staying, let herself into his room, and jumped into his bed. All so that they couldn't prove to the courts they were estranged anymore and wouldn't be able to get a divorce. Now, Doris had tried changing gay men to her team, and now she had taken up her own same-gender affair, becoming a kept woman of the American Margot Hoffman. For years, Hoffman showered Doris with gifts ranging from a palazzo in Venice to aristocratic portraits. At long last in 1938, Doris and the Viscount really, truly, actually divorced. They'd been together nearly a decade, and had been trying to split for practically that entire time. Conveniently for Doris, their official split coincided with World War II starting, and she took the opportunity to run to the safety of New York with Margot Hoffman. It should have been a cushy way to wait out the conflict, but Doris had to go and ruin it. Hoffman was desperately in love with Doris, but Doris's reasons were much darker. Like all of her conquests in the past, she cared first and foremost about Hoffman's pocketbook. There was little evidence she loved Hoffman at all. Eventually, this indifference wore even the devoted Hoffman, and she gave Doris what she deserved. Soon after Doris came to Manhattan with Hoffman, her cash cow got some self-respect and dumped her, leaving her in the lurch. With no man to fall back on, age fast approaching, she was nearly in her 40s, in a foreign country all around her, Doris had to come up with a backup plan fast. And as it happened, that backup plan had a very familiar face. Vulnerable and lonely, Doris went back to the same old, the Viscount Castle Ross. She had been corresponding with him for some time while over in America, and now applied all of her charm to the missives. His letter in response made her heart race, proving that the two of them hadn't learned a dang thing. The Viscount asked Doris to marry him again. While Viscount Castle Ross was writing to his ex-wife, he was also romancing another woman, Viscountess Furness, an Australian heiress who was infamous in her own right. After all, if Doris could play the field, why couldn't he? It was no cakewalk to get back to Europe from America in the 1940s, especially in the middle of a war. She somehow managed to convince Prime Minister Winston Churchill to help her secure air passage over. Now, at this point, Doris had almost entirely run out of money. To supplement her non-existent income, she pawned some of her diamonds, though she hadn't received full payment for them when Churchill sent over her plane tickets. But for now, she was full of hope, set off for her homeland of England, and anticipated walking into the arms of her ex. But the hope was gravely misplaced. When Doris got off the train she took into London, Viscount Castle Ross was waiting to meet her in the darkened station. He then drove her to the Dorchester Hotel, but when she stepped into the building, his jaw dropped. Now that she was in the bright lights, he realized that time had not been kind to the courtesan. Her partying had turned her beauty, perhaps her only asset, into a cheap, haggard imitation of its former glory. After seeing Doris's current state, the Viscount stayed only for a perfunctory dinner, and then went right back to his Australian Viscountess, resolving never to see Doris again. With her future now so uncertain, Doris naturally began to think of the money she was owed from the pawnbroker who had took her diamonds. Unthinking, she telegraphed them about the cash, little knowing that she had just sealed herself into a dark fate. In World War II, selling assets like diamonds was against the law, and Scotland Yard was reading her telegrams with great interest. With Doris so flagrantly breaking the law, officers were at her door in short order, questioning the socialite on what exactly she thought she was doing. Although they didn't immediately charge her and left her rooms, Doris nonetheless began to panic. Visions of a drab, penniless life behind bars danced in her head. With no friends she could call and no lovers to manipulate, she believed she only had one tragic option left: On the 12th of December 1942, Doris took a fatal overdose of sleeping pills at the Dorchester Hotel. She was just 42 years old when she passed, but left behind enough scandal for 3 lifetimes. Now, if you enjoyed this story and are interested in more Hollywood